Morning, everyone. How are you today? Welcome to this open talk with Dr. Adolfo Garcia. Thank you for being here, Adolfo.
My pleasure.
Good, and you?
Doing well. It's a little bit cold this morning, but hopefully we'll be able to make things heat up a little bit here.
Freezing cold today, yes.
Yeah.
Well, my name is Mara Arias. I am a teacher of English from Universidad Nacional de Mar del Plata and also a member of the group Graduados Activos. To discuss some ideas about neuroscience and foreign language teaching. And we are proud to introduce in this open talk Dr. Adolfo Garcia. He's an expert in the neuroscience of language and social interaction. He graduated with honors as a technical scientific translator and teacher of English as well from Universidad Nacional de Mar del Plata. He obtained his PhD in language sciences at UNCUYO, with funding from CONICET. He serves as associate professor and scientific director of the Cognitive Neuroscience Center in Universidad de San Andrés in Argentina. He's an Atlantic Fellow and associate specialist at the Global Brain Health Institute at the University of California. He's an adjunct researcher at the National Scientific and Technical Research Council in Argentina. He is an adjunct professor of neurolinguistics at the Faculty of Education of the National University of Cuyo, a member of the Management Committee of the Translation, Research, Empiricism, and Cognition Network, honorary member of the Center of Cognitive Neuroscience at La Laguna University in Spain, and a high-level talent appointed by the Ministry of Science and Technology of China. Moreover, he serves as director of the Masters in Language and Cognition, which is a postgraduate program that you created at the National University of Cuyo. And his teaching career includes graduate and postgraduate courses in Argentina, Chile, Colombia, the United States, Germany, the United Kingdom, and China. You have more than 170 publications among books, articles, papers in leading journals, and a host of a TV show called Of Brains and Words. So for me, it's a complete honor to have you here.
Thank you very much, Mara. The honor is all mine, and let's get it started.
Fine. We would like to emphasize and to highlight the fact that this is an open talk, and even though most of the audience have already framed questions in the registration process, we invite you to actively participate and to share all your comments, doubts, and to write down any questions that you may come up with. And to start with this open talk, maybe, Adolfo, you can tell us a little bit of what you do, what you study, and maybe what is the connection between neuroscience and foreign language teaching.
All right. Well, basically, I am a cognitive neuroscientist, which means that I'm interested in exploring the connections between our cognitive processes and their biological substrates, basically. What is interesting about cognitive neuroscience is that it offers a bridge between, let's say, typical hardcore natural science approaches and the social sciences. So we're not so much interested in studying the brain in itself as a physical organ, but rather we are interested in using it as another source of evidence to understand what's going on in our daily experiences. when I say we, it's because we really work as a team. I am privileged to be part of a wonderful team of researchers. We have our core at the Cognitive Neuroscience Center at Universidad de San Andres in Argentina, but we are also part of several international networks. And basically, what we do is use different methods of cognitive science and neuroscience to explore language and social cognition in particular. We also do some work on other cognitive domains, such as memory, for instance, and we've done some things on consciousness states, but this is more peripheral. The core of our work has to do with language and social cognition. And basically, what we do is we use different methods, such as structural neuroimaging, functional neuroimaging, electroencephalography, magnetoencephalography, non-invasive brain stimulation, and behavioral methods to understand different aspects of our daily interactive and communicative experiences. We explore these processes in healthy, neurotypical individuals, but we have a strong emphasis also in we on neurodegenerative patients in particular. So we work with neurological and psychiatric conditions, and within neurological samples, we have developed a lot of expertise in neurodegeneration. So, and especially in the last few years, we've been concentrating lots of our efforts in exploring neurocognitive dimensions in Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, frontotemporal dementia, spinal cerebellar ataxia, and things like that. But also, we work with stroke patients, epileptic patients, and then within the psychiatric domain, we work with obsessive compulsive disorder and other populations. And basically, by integrating experimental tasks with ecological approaches, behavioral and neural measures in both healthy and pathological populations, you can have an overarching idea of how your cognitive systems are organized, how they are deployed, how they vary as a function of your personal experiences, and how they may become affected by different patterns of, let's say, disturbance of your central nervous system.
Wow, sounds really complex
It is as
and interesting.
it is as complex as any other thing in which you try to work hard at. Let's say so. Maybe there's a lot of technological devices here, and of course there's a lot of complex statistical approaches underlying all of this. And this is a really multidisciplinary setting. I mean, we are constantly working at the interface among neurology, psychiatry, linguistics, social science, data science, statistics, neurophysiology. We've done work with genetics, but the truth is that it is complex. I don't think it's any more complex than doing hardcore, good old-fashioned linguistics, or being really imbued within the study of, I don't know, teaching from a social perspective, or mathematics, or any other thing. I mean, it is complex. It has its own type of complexity, but I would not say that it is more or less complex than anything to which you really commit.
Okay, and I like this idea that different fields are integrated, and that you see your own field of studies as in connection with many other things, not just the study of the brain as an organ in itself.
Absolutely, yes. And in fact, it suffices to take a look at the background of our team. If you ever showed up at our lab, you would see that we have people with a background in biology. We have engineers, physicists, linguists, psychologists, neurologists. We have data science specialists. At one point, we even had a musician as part of the team, and so this is what makes it what keeps things interesting too, because no single project could be carried out the way we do it without joining and linking the virtues of all the members of the team, right? And this sort of distributed cognition in which it is the sum of the part and the contributions of each member that really leads to the project. It's one of the things. It's one of the perks of neuroscience, and perhaps that's one thing that maybe distinguishes neuroscience from other fields which are more monolithic or self-centered in their approaches,
Fine.
right?
Okay, okay, great. I completely agree. And there's something interesting about this talk and the title that we have chosen for it. That is neuroscience and foreign language teaching beyond feel-good talk. So I would like you to tell us, what do you mean by that?
Well, uh, this follows from my appraisal of how neuroscience has been used mainly in different niches when when talking to audiences who are not specialists in neuroscience. So something that concerns me is that this neuro boom that we are going through, for the past 10, 15 years, everything seems to be prefixed by neuro. So you have neuro marketing, neuro philosophy, neuro whatever, what have you, right? And that's really that can be some funky business right there, because yeah, the brain is something that's really captivating. We are all interested in learning something about our brains, but what I've noticed is that, especially in the interaction with bilingualism and foreign language teaching and things like that, uh, most of the talks that I had the chance to see, are being offered around there. They're not being really delivered by neuroscientists per se. What you have is secondhand commentators who are not part of neuroscience and who have no background in actual research. So you have outsiders who are, say, spectators of the field, and not even the core of the field. Because then, if you take a look at the type of things that they present, well, it's at least dubious. And then there's another thing, which is that I've noticed there's a tendency for these talks delivered by people who are not part of the field to pretty much appeal to confirmation biases, to try to make to make the audiences feel better about themselves, to make them as if it were some sort of self-help kind of talk, just trying to reinforce pre-existing values and trying to come up with positive messages. And that's not really the goal of neuroscience. And and in general, I think that does a disservice to how we should be communicating science. And to communicate science in a really responsible way, we have to be strict about the methodological training that we have, and also we have to be explicit about the pros and cons. We have to be able to tell the difference between a result and a fact, which are not the same thing. We have to be able to tell the both sides of the story. When there's a study that suggests that there's a certain relationship between two things, and that may seem empowering and encouraging, but at the same time, chances are that behind every study that reported something that appeals to how you would like the world to be, there's another study that reported something that goes against that. And there's a selection bias too, in the sense that there's an overemphasis in positive results, in showing positive results, to the detriment of results that may not be so popular, so catchy, which is the same thing that happens in the media. So I think that we need to be a little bit more pluralistic and impartial in our and professional in our delivery and presentation and discussion of scientific findings. And we really have to overcome talks that are just aimed to make you feel better about yourself. And we have to start favoring spaces and events that allow science to make you learn a little bit more about how the field of science is progressing in a given domain, irrespective of whether that actually coincides with what you would like to hear or not.
Okay. Good. I completely agree with you. I think that we need to give more room to be more responsible and professional about the things that we share with the community.
Absolutely.
Um,
And you know, it took me some time to feel, let's say, comfortable enough and let's say sufficiently prepared to do these things. And the analogy that I always entertain is the following one. When I'm watching a soccer game, for instance, right? I like to listen to Kike Wolf as a broadcaster, basically. You know, he was a soccer player. He was there. He knows
yeah,
what it is to have your ankle swollen, and
exactly,
you
exactly.
know, he had the mud of the field, you know, on
Yeah,
his face. I'd rather listen to that guy than any other, you know, good-looking hotshot and commentator.
commenter.
Yeah,
Yes,
so that's the thing. You know, you may choose to listen to what someone who has been there has to say, or not, and that's perfectly okay. But at the very least, we should be offering equal opportunities to both options, right?
exactly, exactly. I do love football, so I know what you're talking about.
All right, all right.
And it is not the same. I mean, you have different people talking about the same thing, but the comments are not exactly the same, and it's not as enriching or interesting as the person who actually knows what he's talking about.
Or maybe it's the other way around. Maybe the person who's not a part of the field itself, maybe they have something that's catchier to say. Maybe they have you
Okay.
know, something that seems to be more engaging or even compelling. But perhaps, you know, compellingness and catchiness should not be the standards by which we judge the relevance, the pertinence, and the responsibility of scientific dissemination.
Okay. Okay. Now, when we started with this, and now thinking about this, we are in a particular situation. We are living a particular situation in which we are in isolation, we are in lockdown, and one of the questions that we were asked from the audience, which I think is very interesting to discuss, is, in your opinion, how do you think that this current pandemic situation has affected education? Um, Whether there are differences between learning in the classroom and distance learning, um, and how is it that apps and technologies and the use of computer affects the learning and maybe the way the brain functions in students and in teachers as well?
Right. Well, so as to be consistent with what I just said, first thing I need to mention is that this is not something that that I do research on in
Okay.
particular, and so this is not going to be a Kike Wolf kind of commentary you're going to be receiving from me here. But I do want to say that there are many researchers who are conducting direct first-hand research in this, and they will be way more qualified than I am to say this. So I'll just keep the first part of the question of my answer very brief here, and I'll be relying more on my experience as a teacher and as a director of a master's program than as a scientist here. Yes, I mean this has affected education as much as any other field you can think of. If anything, the fact that we have been able to find ways to continue educational processes with all the limitations we are aware of, when you consider that there are many other walks of life that have been 100% interrupted by the pandemic. First thing I want to say is that when you start looking at the forest, you know, behind the educational tree, you will find that the fact that there is some way of keeping things going is in itself a good thing. It could be worse. That being said, there are many ways in which this has changed and proven detrimental to the way in which we typically uh, you know, organize and deliver classes, right? The lack of direct face-to-face contact is really pernicious to communication. in the sense that maybe we are not so much aware of it when we are not deprived of it. But basically, face-to-face communication is it is much it is certainly richer in the sense that we are able to derive a lot of communicative cues from the very from many factors that are absent when you are not in the same room with a person. For example, proxemics. I mean, the distance that you assume relative to another person when you are communicating, how you move your body, many peripheral cues that has at this very moment, for instance, Mara, I'm moving my hands and you cannot see them. And the movements that I'm making with my hands, they are not arbitrary. They do have communicative value. And just because of the
Exactly.
of the physical position of the camera, you're not getting to see that, right? All of these things, we tend to overestimate language as a medium of communication. The truth is that we are semiotically plural beings. When we are communicating, we are exchanging signals by means of many, many, many resources. Our faces, our facial contortions, our our bodily position, how we are moving our hands, how you are, where you're frowning, how you are standing, your the distance that you assume, and many, many things. And the truth is that, for better or worse, remote communication cuts off, some of those resources. Uh, at the same time, well, there's an effect that at first I thought it was just something like a media hype, and that was going on, but there happens to be some scientific research on it, which is the so-called Zoom fatigue. And
Yes.
there is, it's something that perhaps everybody who's listening to us now, or who will listen to us later on, they are experiencing, right? Yeah, because we're spending so much time. uh, I don't know if the time on screen has changed for all people. In my case, I don't think it has changed per se, but I do spend much more time having one-on-one or group conversations, and yeah, there comes a time where you start feeling, that your attention is no longer the same, and you have the temptation, just because nobody can see what you're doing, of opening your email. I know you're reading your email right now, Mara. You cannot tell from your and that is also, it also has an impact on communication. So there is that. At the same time, let's be a little bit. Let's try to be more balanced here. There are some good things
Okay.
about this. For example,
Okay.
some universities, when they realize that they know that they have moved to fully online courses, they realized, hey, now we are not limited to the teaching staff that we have here at home, and they started inviting world leading professors to teach a class within their courses or things like that. That would not have been able to happen in a pre-pandemic world,
Exactly.
and so there's a little bit of the good and the bad here, and then to provide some scientific evidence here, the impact of screen exposure on our neurocognition is I don't want to say tremendously documented, but there are a number of studies that have provided interesting results. One thing that we need to say, for example, there's a very popular paper by Patricia Cole, must be now 15 years or so, in which she introduced the social gating hypothesis. Basically, what they did was they worked with American babies. They were around 1 year old, and they exposed them to Mandarin Chinese, right? And the idea was to see how many phonemic contrasts the babies could learn, and they did this by means of three ways of exposure. The first condition was just auditory exposure. The babies would
Okay.
listen to Chinese, no visual cues present. The second one was an audio-visual presentation. So here the babies, they will be looking at a screen, yeah. So they would have the audio and the video, yeah. But again, it was a pre-recorded video, right? I mean, there was no dynamic, spur of the moment interaction. And then there was a regular face-to-face interaction with a teacher that would, interact with them, that would synchronize the movements and the speech turns, and it would be a much more dialogical, as it were, setting. But what's found here was that screen exposure, as well as the exclusively auditory presentation, resulted in a significantly lesser development of phonological skills in the foreign language. Basically, children were able to recognize the difference between different phonemes of a new language when this was presented in a face-to-face, interactive, dynamic context than it was when it was done, for example, via screen, right? So
Okay.
there's something to be said about that. Another thing that is worth mentioning is a much more recent study published in one of the leading venues for pediatric research, which is JAMA Pediatrics. And basically, this study was reported in which they explored an association between screen time in early infancy and the white matter integrity of different neural tracts that are critical for the development of linguistic skills and for basically, let's say, literacy across the lifespan. And what they found was that there was a significant negative correlation between screen exposure. This is counting TV, tablets, laptops, cell phones,
Okay.
everything together, screen exposure, and the white matter integrity of the uncinate fasciculus, the inferior longitudinal fasciculus, and the arcuate fasciculus. These are three white matter. These are three structural tracts in our brain which subserve many, many different functions, among which, critically, you find a number of linguistic skills and a number of domain general functions. So there, again, this is not a causal relation. It's a correlation. It may be the case that there's another factor that accounts for
Okay.
this observation, but the correlation is there. The longer the screen time exposure in early infancy, the lower the white matter integrity in these tracts. So it's one way of bridging the social world with the neural world. And then another thing that's interesting is there's a study by Oppenheimer. I think it was Mueller and Oppenheimer, whose title is very self-explanatory. It's called "The Keyboard." The pen is mightier than the keyboard. That's what it's called. Basically, what they did was
Okay.
to assess how note-taking impacted information retrieval and comprehension when it is performed in two different ways. One, longhand, when you're just using a pencil or a pen on a piece of paper, versus when you do that using a
In the
laptop.
keyboard.
Exactly, right? So basically what they did was they presented TED Talks to two groups of participants, and the task was, well, take notes, and then we're going to ask you some questions to see how much you understood and how much you remember, right? And basically, to make it very short, they found that people who had used the keyboard, they were able to copy verbatim, word by word, much longer stretches of what the speaker had said. But when it came to testing the retrieval and the comprehension of the information, those who had used, the good old-fashioned, pencil and paper approach,
Pencil.
they
Okay.
they were actually they outperformed the keyboard users. And the idea is basically that just because the keyboard is as a motoric scale allows you to cover much more ground much faster, you feel tempted to try to capture everything as if you were, transcribing what the speaker is saying. However, because the unimanual task of writing is motorically more limited, and you need much more time to write the same word, you
Mm-hmm.
feel you are implicitly led to processing information on a much deeper level so that you can summarize or come up with a little symbol or a graph or abbreviations. And ultimately, those little tricks that you automatically deploy just to be able to perform the task end up fueling the retrievability and the comprehensibility of information.
Very interesting findings that you're sharing. Very interesting, because as you said at the very beginning, it is interesting to see that many of the things that we maybe think about are actually based on real research and based on real papers that investigations were carried out. even though this is a situation that is currently taking place. There are some comments from the audience, as I have here. They are saying that they agree with you that about what you said, the peripheral cues loss. And could you please share again the title of the different papers that you have referred to? You mentioned 3 papers specifically.
I do remember the title of the third one I mentioned, which is the pen is mightier than the keyboard.
Than the keyboard.
Then the one I don't really remember them now, but what we could do is I can look them up later and we can paste them on the Facebook wall or something.
Yeah, sure, good. Because as you said at the very beginning, I think it is very interesting that we start looking for resources that are scientifically or based on specific research that has been carried out.
Let me add one thing. Yes, I think we need to do that, not because science has the ultimate answer to everything. I mean, there is a room for your own personal experience. There is a room for introspection. There is a room for any other approach. But what we cannot afford to do is to ignore science. I mean, I guess my ethos is more of that of an equal opportunity employer here. Let's say I'm not trying to say science will have the ultimate answer. Everything else is rubbish. No, on the contrary. I mean, I believe that there is value in every single approach that lends itself to reflection and that informs our decision making. What we cannot afford to do is to let those processes fall entirely in the hands of our introspection or our biases. I mean, there's science is it's an imperfect but very useful source of insights, and we can do better than to ignore that line of contribution.
Okay, thanks. Then something more related to foreign language teaching and foreign language learning, and that is, how is it that foreign language learning impact brain activity?
Well, this is a controversial topic in the literature, and one that has certainly lent itself to, let's say, some biases and some twists and turns in the way in which results have been communicated, both in the scientific world and in the media. There's if you want to understand how foreign language teaching impacts your brain, science is about comparisons. So, we're always comparing something to something. That is how we can know what makes the first something different or special, or what typifies it. So when you want to understand how learning a foreign language impacts your brain, the typical approach that has been used is to compare bilingual, or let's say multilingual individuals with monolingual individuals, right?
Yes.
That's the main approach. There's a surge of research using this approach. A number of studies have shown that, or provided evidence that it's consistent with the idea that bilingualism, your incorporation of a second language, either as a second or a foreign language. I mean, we can speak about this even irrespective of age of appropriation, right?
Okay.
It may lead to certain cognitive advantages. So, for example, when you compare the performance of bilingual individuals with sociodemographically matched monolingual people, you will see that the former, a number of studies show certain advantages in attentional domains, in inhibitory skills. Some of them report advantages in working memory, and that's very interesting. The thing is that for every study that has documented an advantage, there are others. There are other studies that have documented null differences. That is to say,
Okay.
no differences between the performance of bilingual and monolingual individuals. In fact, for the domains that I mentioned, inhibitory controls, for example, is one that's very, very much controversial because there's a lot of evidence showing no differences between bilinguals and monolinguals. That being said, uh, the consensus nowadays in the field, I don't even know. No, I guess consensus is too big of a word. Um, there's a substantial part of the scientific world that is leaning towards this interpretation. The problem is that we have been comparing bilinguals versus monolinguals as if the bilingual community were completely homogeneous, as if there was something like the bilingual. And when you take a look at this, first of all, there are many different definitions of bilingualism in the literature.
That's what I wanted to ask you, because there's a TV show in which you actually give a definition, which I found really interesting. So I would like you to give it, and for the audience to have an idea of the complex term of bilingualism. And
Yeah, it is a complex term, and it has been defined variously in the literature, dating back to maybe the 1930s. Bloomfield's definition, which is it's a definition that many people still entertain nowadays, somewhat outdatedly. Which proposed that you could only say that a person is bilingual if he or she has native or near native command of two
exactly.
right? Well, that's not how we think about things nowadays. Basically, the definition that's receiving the greater agreement and consensus right now is one that posits that a bilingual is any person who can speak, not even speak, use, let's say.
Okay.
And that's an important distinction. Who can use one or more. First thing to discuss, languages or dialects. Second thing to discuss, at any level of competence that enables that person to fulfill his or her communicative goals. So when you think about this, this is a maximally inclusive definition, and actually following this definition,
Exactly.
you will see, and there's actually quantitative data about this, that over half the world qualifies as a bilingual, basically. In fact, there are estimations that propose that the ratio of bilinguals to monolinguals will be something like 3-1. So bilingualism, far from being something that's unusual or an ave raris, it's something that seems to be the predominant linguistic profile of people around the world. What's really, really hard to find when we are conducting these experiments is people who are purely monolingual. That's that's the real problem.
Wow.
Yeah, think about it. In your own experience, someone who really, really has no knowledge, no contact whatsoever in
Exactly.
foreign language, it is so hard to find that. So when that's the thing. And then if you're thinking about bilinguals, as accounting for something like 50 or 60 or 70% of the world population, it stands to reason that there's going to be a lot of variety among them. And in fact, bilingual is a term, it's such a broad term that it ends up meaning virtually nothing, because you can, bilinguals differ in their level of competence. From incipient bilinguals to what is nowadays called ambilinguals, or people who are fully fluent in more than one language. But then again, you can differ in your age of appropriation. When you incorporated that language, you have this
Language.
in early and late bilinguals. And this impinges on which brain mechanisms are going to be devoted to processing even the same levels of linguistic information. You can have bilinguals who are active bilinguals in certain modalities and passive bilinguals in certain modalities. So, there are people who regularly read very fluently in English, but they cannot engage in conversation.
Okay.
And there are many, many other factors dealing with the level of acculturation and the topological relations between the languages. that accounts for the level of transfer and interference that there may be between your mother tongue and any ulterior language. So there's all of this, and when you start taking a look at these factors, the studies that have compared bilinguals with monolinguals have not been very scrupulous in specifying the type of bilingual of subpopulation that they have been targeting. And this may be one of the factors that accounts for why some studies show significant results and other studies show no differences. Maybe it has to do with the specific profile of bilinguals that have been targeted in the research. And the same applies for studies that have compared levels of functional activation in your brain, or structural anatomical properties of the brain. Some studies point to differences between bilinguals and monolinguals, but some others do not. And again, the same confusion or confounds may be present in the research. But there's something that we can say here, which is that what no study has shown is that bilingualism will be disadvantaged, will disadvantages the development of these skills. There is one aspect in which bilinguals seem to be at a disadvantage, which is some aspects of fluency and lexical knowledge. If you compare the bulk of vocabulary that a bilingual knows in any of his or her languages, and you compare it to the level of vocabulary of a socio-demographically matched person who is monolingual, usually the monolingual will outperform the bilingual in terms of that vocabulary knowledge. But then again, if you put together both languages, the bilingual, that difference disappears. Other than this, and other minor things like fluency and tip of the tongue states, there's
exactly, yeah.
There's research that shows that bilinguals tend to have more tip of the tongue states than monolinguals. When you are about to find a word and it's just there, you just cannot come up with it.
Yeah.
But
happens a lot.
these are things. Yeah, these are things that they are documented. There are a number of studies that point in this direction, but it's not something that's going to be detrimental to your daily functioning or your professional functioning. So what really is we have to say is that it may be that bilingualism confers certain advantages for some subset of the bilingual population. We don't know exactly which subset. We don't know exactly which factors need to converge for you to actually capitalize on those potential advantages.
Okay.
We do know that there's nothing to be said against bilingualism, so we can keep on, raising this positive message, I think.
And learning languages as well. There are two things that you have just said, which I want to comment on. That is, you said that regardless of the age of appropriation of the language. So we have studied at university about this critical period for learning a second language. Is there a critical period? Is there an age in which it is better or preferable for people to learn a second language?
Well, I don't know if there are a number of things to be said there. First, the critical period, the very notion of critical periods, like moments during which you either do it or you will not be able to do it. It's no longer entertained as such in the literature. So a more flexible construct is being used nowadays, which refers to optimal windows, right? So there are moments, there are stages in your life cycle in which your organism is better predisposed at incorporating certain types of information than it is at others, right? Then another thing is that if you think about either critical periods, if you want to subscribe to that vision, or to optimal windows in terms of language as a whole, you're going to be missing the point, because language is a very complex thing, and language subsumes many different systems and levels and processes, and some of those processes have maturational stages and cycles that are different from others. So, for example, there are the optimal windows that are present for the incidental acquisition of phonemic contrasts, for instance, are different from the optimal windows for your development of morphosyntactic patterns, and they are different from the optimal windows that you can find for the learning of vocabulary and new, lexicosemantic pairings. So one major problem in everyday discussions about this is that the question tends to be posed in relation to language as a whole, and that's a misspecification, and it's very hard to answer that question because it subsumes many different things which have their own way of behaving, right? But basically,
Okay.
and one more thing, what the optimal window or critical period view implies, and this is not often made explicit, is that what you're referring to is to the incidental um, incorporation of information. That is to say, at which point your brain is better equipped to incorporate that information without explicit and metalinguistic and guided instruction. Because the truth is that with sufficient dedication, time, you can hone your linguistic abilities at any time of your life. It may take you longer, it may be more effortful, and then but you can do it. The thing is that you will not no longer be relying on the neurocognitive systems that are optimally suited for the incidental development of these skills, as happens in early life, for instance, with your mother tongue and its subsystems, right? And then another thing to be mentioned here is that we tend to have a narrow focus on language proper when we're thinking about these things, but we have to think of ourselves as social individuals. And I have a 1-year-old baby, and now he's going through this wonderful babbling stage. Little by little, he's becoming aware of certain contrasts. Oh, some of the things that I hear around me mean this, and some others mean this. They refer to this, and that's wonderful. But and he's gonna be developing these contrasts at a speed and with an efficiency in the following couple of years that will exceed whatever I'm gonna be able to do if I started to learn a new language tomorrow, right? But you also have to think about this. Yes, there are neuromaturational factors. The dissemination of myelin in certain associative areas versus primary areas, the relative reliance on procedural versus declarative memory systems and things like that. But there's another factor that we need to take into account, and is often overlooked, which is my baby really doesn't have more than 2 worries in the world right now. I mean, he wants to eat, he wants to play, and the rest of his developing brain is pretty much open to capturing things. There's nothing that's really conjuring up his attention minute after minute. Think about your daily life, Mayra. You are constantly bombarded by things that are occupying resources in your mind. The bills you have to pay, the paper you need to submit, the exam you need to correct, etc. And so when you take a more let's say a longer temporal scale vision of this, there's also that we cannot assume that a more or less mature brain will be better or worse at incorporating information, irrespective of the overall social milieu in which it is embedded, right?
Okay. Now, we are talking about babies and little children who are learning how to speak their own mother tongue. Now, in kindergarten, something happens, especially when they are immersed in English classes. And what happens with that child, especially when they are learning to read and write in English as well as in Spanish, in this case, right? In this particular context in Argentina.
I have to say I don't know. I mean, from a research standpoint, again, this is not something I've ever done research on, and I don't think I've even as a reader, who's interested in things like this, I'm not so sure that I've ever ventured into the literature that explores let's say, bilingual script development, or bilingual writing
Okay.
skills. What, but I can tell you a couple of things. First of all, there are some aspects of writing development which are very consistent across languages. One of them, for
Okay.
instance, one of them has to do with what is known as the mirror writing stage, right? Maybe parents out there will have noticed that when their children are developing their writing skills, they tend to type to write letters backwards, right?
Exactly.
And some people may actually feel worried about that. Hey, what's going on? So can't my child realize the difference between not doing an R this way or an R
Yeah,
this way?
yes.
Well, the truth is that at the very early stages, no. And that's actually a very healthy symptom. When you think about it, what writing means is a connection between the visual and the phonological world. Letters are conventional symbols which point to phonemes, basically. Uh, some languages do it more systematically when they are more transparent, as in the case of German or Spanish. Some languages are more opaque in the sense that a single letter may point to very different phonemes depending on the context in which it is used, such as English, of course, right? But here's the thing: you're trying to the child is creating these links between these visual objects, which are letters, and these phonemes. And up until that point, the child is treating letters as if they were any other type of visual object. Let me just do something very quickly here. Can you see this, Mara? Can you see
Yes.
my phone here? Okay, so if I put it like this,
Yes.
what would you call this? What is this?
Phone.
It's a phone. Okay. Now, what if I put it like this? What would you call this?
A phone.
What if I went like this?
A phone.
You call it a
It is a
phone.
phone. No matter how you
So,
put
visual
it.
objects, they are position invariant. What they are called, what
Okay.
they stand for, doesn't change based on their
Okay.
position. Letters happen to be a very particular type of visual objects in which their identity depends on their position. So if I do something like this,
Exactly.
it's one
For me.
thing. Well, for me, it's a B.
Exactly.
I don't know if the camera is capturing it the other way around.
I
But if I
think so.
but if I go like this,
Yeah.
now it's
Go
a
ahead.
different letter. So
Exactly.
that mirror stage is actually symptomatic of the processes that are converging in the development of writing, and a milestone towards actual literacy consists in that magical moment in which children realize that letters are very particular visual objects, such that they can only work well if you put them in a certain position, right?
Okay.
Uh, so and that's constant across languages. Um, and Yeah, and then, well, there are a number of other things that could be said about uh, writing, but maybe one that has to do with comparisons between languages is that the level of transferability of writing skills from one language to another will depend largely on the typological closeness or proximity of the languages.
Okay.
So, sometimes, and it's not even the typological proximity, it has to do with the very idiosyncrasies of the languages that are involved. Because uh, think about the case of a Spanish English bilingual, right? Or a child who's a native user of Spanish and who's learning English. Well, some of the patterns and the systematicities between the graphemic and the phonemic world that child is learning will be different from the correspondences that you can expect in English. So, precisely because of this, one and the same letter,
Mhm.
in Spanish, basically, with the exception of the letters C and G, which may be pronounced as C or K or H or G, right? Depending on genio and gato or Cecilia and casa, right? Other than that, the entire phonemic repertoire is pretty stable in terms of how it relates to graphemes. But in English, you don't have this. So sometimes the rate of development of writing skills in one and other language, especially when you have tasks such as writing to dictation, may differ,
Yes.
and they will not be indicative of any type of individual or even cultural advantage or disadvantage. It may just have to
Okay.
do with how much information you can bring to the table from your mother tongue into the new task that you're learning in the other language, right?
Okay. Fine. Very interesting. Thanks. Um, you also mentioned something about an approach earlier before, and there are many questions about what type of approach is better for our brain when learning a foreign language. And this is something that we study along the way in the university. I mean, all the different approaches and the development throughout history of different approaches. So do you think that there is one unique approach that is best for our brains to acquire language?
The answer is obviously no, because what that question is missing out on is what is the goal of your learning? And not everybody learns a language for the same purpose. Maybe I'm learning a language just because I need to pass an exam to be admitted at a university, and I don't really care about
Right.
using that language. Well, maybe under those circumstances, if it's a standardized test, maybe I'm going to do quite well for many of the sections of those tests with very traditional, old-fashioned approaches. But if my goal is to, I don't know, become a better reader of literature in a foreign language, well, that may lend itself to other approaches that may be more conducive to boosting those skills. But maybe what I want to do is just live abroad, or I want to go to university abroad. Well, then you need to start thinking about how you're going to deploy yourself, communicatively in functional settings, surrounded by people in dynamic environments. Well, these are very, very different reasons, all of them valid, for which you may want to learn a foreign language. And if you think about this, the methods that may actually lead to optimal situations for you to be able to do those things may be quite different. So I guess one thing that I would like to say is that you cannot answer this question, by pushing away from the scene the goal of learning. And it is only when you know the goal of learning that you can start deciding
Mm-hmm.
what your tools are going to be. To think that there's going to be a single approach, a single teaching method, a single way of constructing the pedagogical or the didactic toolkit that you're going to give to the classroom, and that's going to be be a one for all kind of resource. I think that's the real thing that we need to be aware of.
Okay. There's a lot of talk about um, communicative approaches, which is mentioned and in most schools nowadays, and in which the aim is to promote like English only speaking classrooms, and there's sometimes no room for the use of the native language, the use of our mother tongue, of Spanish. Now, you were saying something about transferring information from one language to another. What do you think about this type of approach within the classrooms and this idea of pushing aside Spanish and just speaking English as the best way to acquire English in the classroom?
No, I don't agree with it in principle. Um, the question would be: are you forbidding the use of Spanish because you believe that it is detrimental to the learning of English? Well, if that were the case, that it would make sense. Or do you believe that if you do it, you're going to be slowing down the incorporation of English information? Well, if that were the case, that would make sense. Or do you believe that Spanish really has no bearing? It really has no impact on your mother tongue has really it plays no role in how you incorporate information from another language? Well, if that were the case, it would be okay. But the thing is that none of these things actually work like that. And I do understand the idea that we have only, I don't know, maybe 4 hours of L2 class a week, so we want to maximize the time to
Exactly.
use English. Okay, well, that makes sense, but when you think about it in the overall scheme of things, well, yeah, but you really believe that 20 minutes, an added 20 minutes of English exposure over the first 20 years of a person's life are really going to make much of a difference? And if you think about it this way, then maybe the answer is no. And if the answer is no, is, well, don't you believe that what you already know about a language that you master because you're a native speaker of it might, won't be useful or helpful for you to anchor new linguistic information, either to find similarities, recurrences, dissimilarities, patterns of inconsistency, or things like that? Well, um, this is not arguing for an entirely, grammar translation method, or just relying on translation as a pedagogical tool. On the contrary, I guess my point is, why would you deprive yourself of using that tool as a complement to many other tools? Really, is there no way to reconcile um, a task-based approach with a functional perspective, and maybe a couple of reading exercises, and maybe use translation for a couple of things? Really, are there such hardcore, tightly knit dichotomies that one thing cannot take place in the presence of the other? Well, I try to think about uh, our experience in general in less, let's say, divisionist terms than that. And by thinking about it this way, I'm not saying that you should rely only on translation. I would never do that, but there's certainly a room for it. So in any case, anything for which you say, I'm not going to do this just out of principle, it's something that I would be a little bit suspicious about.
Okay. And is there other studies or research that say that it is even possible to like shut down your Spanish and then, well, all my brain is working in English? Is that possible?
It's not exactly like that, but you're not completely off either. I mean, uh, when one of the things that our brain needs to do whenever we're doing something is engage in a balance between the activation of certain processes and the inhibition of other processes. Even in the simplest thing that you're doing, when you are moving your hand to grab a glass, not only is your brain sending information for your hand and your fingers to spread in a certain uh, uh, in a certain way, and for you to exert a certain amount of pressure depending on the size and the weight of the object, but also your brain is telling your hand not to do certain things, and that balance between
Okay.
activation, excitation, and inhibition is part and parcel of everything that we do, even in the simplest cognitive, motoric, emotional, interoceptive task that you can think of. With language, the same thing happens. So if you're a bilingual or a trilingual or multilingual, and you establish a base language like we've done now, English is our base language now. Well,
Exactly.
I have to, there's a tacit code by which we say, okay, so we're talking in English now. And some of the things that my brain has to do is to try to keep Spanish at bay in a way, right?
Exactly.
When you do this, you can only do it to a certain extent. First of all, there are studies that show that whenever you're processing a certain language, even if it's your foreign language, there will be co-activation of your first language, right? Both languages are going to be active in parallel. So there's actually electrophysiological evidence, and there's behavioral evidence about this. And there's no way in which you can completely shut off the other language. In fact, when that regulation doesn't work properly, you can have phenomena that are exclusive to multilingual people, such as switching or mixing, right?
Exactly.
And sometimes you can do those things on purpose because you want to create a certain rhetorical effect. Sometimes you can resort to another language because you want to be funny, or you want to create a certain, or you want to allude to something in particular. But other than these strategic uses, sometimes this happens because there's a transient misregulation of your cognitive control system, right? In fact, in some neurological patients, in some cases of aphasia, there are people who, because they have sustained a certain brain lesion affecting, for example, the caudate nucleus or the anterior cingulate cortex, they are unable to suppress the language that they are not using. And there are syndromes that are known as pathological mixing and pathological switching. These are people who just, because of the brain lesion that they sustain, they can no longer keep this control mechanism working properly. But what happens is that you may be able, even when you are properly shutting off the outward emergence of the other language, there's no way in which you can totally suppress the co-activation of languages. And probably this has to do with how we incorporate new languages. When you're incorporating a new word, uh, something that will happen, even if you don't want it to, irrespective of the approach that your teacher was using, if you were actually learning English in a classroom setting, is that you're going to be creating links to what you already know. And what you already know is your mother.
Exactly.
So that, and once those links are created, you may become better at setting them apart as you become more competent, but you will never be able to fully suppress them, right?
So at the same time as we are speaking in English, my brain is actually activating the Spanish as well.
Yeah, my hope is that what your Spanish brain is telling you now is not, okay, I can't wait for this to be over. I have so many things to do this Saturday, but yeah.
Do not interrupt, do not interrupt, do not interrupt. Okay, and I think it is very interesting because you see this in I teach at a kindergarten, and you can see this constant fluency or interaction and connection between English and Spanish. It's like sometimes they say some phrases in English and then they mix Spanish and English with, and they don't see that. I mean, it is us that we see these outcomes,
Right,
and
but
they do it naturally.
this is something that also has to do with the way in which the specific field of foreign language teaching has evolved, and this is actually symptomatic of something that happens across disciplines. There tends to be a pendular motion in trends in science and in different fields, right? Same goes for philosophy, sociology, linguistics, such that if a given approach that has been mainstream up to a certain moment, it starts to go into crisis, and then a
Exactly.
new proposal comes. It tends to be rather dichotomical. It tends to be sort of its binary opposite. And it's only with the passing of time that you realize that there may be some slight shed of relevance in this approach, just as there is some shed of relevance in this approach. And in any case, what we should be wary about is assuming that for you to endorse a certain approach, you must completely skew the contributions of every other approach. You may feel better or more comfortable or more convinced by the proposal of a certain framework, but that doesn't mean that there are no islands of value in others, right? And I think that
Exactly.
becoming aware of these biases that we are all prey to in our daily lives is part of the things that we can do here as communicators and disseminators of science.
Exactly. As well as having in mind what is the goal and the objective of the language learning.
Right, right.
Exactly. Some people from the audience are asking us about some papers And there is something that I want you to say on the papers and the journals that you have written down. I said at the very beginning that you have published more than 170 papers, among books as well, and mainly focused on neurolinguistics and biolingualism. So what books, what reading material would you recommend to the audience and to all of those who want to start introducing themselves into neurolinguistics or cognitive neuroscience?
Well, if that's the question, then I would not suggest any of my books. I think that there's far better literature out there. If someone wants to, uh, there's perhaps one book that I wrote with my good friend and colleague Agustin Ibanez, which may be a nice entryway for people who are just entering neuroscience for the first time.
Exactly.
It's called ¿Qué son las neurociencias? It was published by Paidos here in Argentina in 2015, and it's a layman's introduction to neuroscience, and yeah, and we try to do our best to try to anchor the content in popular culture, movies, music, jokes, things like that. So it's non-technical, and that might work. But then, if I am to recommend one author who is not just a state-of-the-art cognitive neuroscience, I mean, a leading figure of the field, but at the same time an amazing disseminator, I would recommend Stanislas Dehaene. And he's, I mean, he has a number of books that are just wonderful at achieving a good balance between scientific rigor and accessibility. Uh, People who are listening to this to this session might be interested in particular in one book that's called Reading in the Brain, and whose translation into Spanish in Argentina was published by Siglo XXI, and I think it is El Cerebro Lector. That's what it's called here. Wonderful book if people want to learn about how or what we know so far about how our brains manage reading, basically. Um, and um, and then something that may be of interest is that there are some journals that are specifically devoted to connections between education and neuroscience. There's a journal that's called Mind, Brain, and Education. It's published by Wiley. So that's something that may be worth mentioning. And going back to my books, there's a 2016 book that we published here in Argentina, which is called Mente Bilingüe, and it's I think it's the first Spanish language compilation of insights from psycholinguistics and cognitive science about what we know about bilingualism. And then people who are more interested in linguistics proper, I have this book I published in 2017 by Equinox in London, which is called An Introduction to Relational Networks Theory. It's a little bit more technical about a particular.
There's another one that was prefaced by Michael Halliday as well.
That's the one. That's the one, actually.
That's the one.
Yeah. One of the perks of this profession is getting to know your heroes, and
Exactly.
And I got to strike a close friendship with Michael. I actually, my wife and I, we lived with him. We spent 3 weeks living with him, and after that was in Australia, in Sydney, a couple of years after I first met him in China. And what a wonderful, what a unique individual. He knew everything. He always knew more than you about everything. There's not a single thing in which you would be able to know more than him. At the same time, he was so generous, so open, so critical, and the guy was a lot of fun. we
Great combination.
we just had a blast. Yes, and yeah, I remember it was in China when I asked him to forward or preface or this book for me. He told me, "No, I'm no longer doing those things. So what is it about?" And I told him, "Well, I want to do this and that." Okay, no, that's interesting. Okay, I'll do it. And a funny thing is that Michael never used a computer, never in his life. So if you wanted to reach out to him, he would have to email his wife, Rukaya. Rukaya would print out the emails from Michael. Michael would write the response in his typewriter, and then he would either mail you the letter, or he would ask Rukaya to scan the typewritten message and email it to you. And for this forward that he wrote, he mailed it to me, and it even has pen correction, that's sort of liquid paper kind of amendment. So
Old school.
old school. That's one of the nicest things that has happened to me so far in my career. Yeah.
So glad to hear. Thanks for sharing. There's another question from the audience who would like to know, what does neuroscience research have to tell us about test design?
Well, there are a number of insights you can you can derive from neuroscience. But then again, it's I guess the idea is to try to capitalize on what we know about the way in which we process information and we learn, right? Um, so our brains are um, prey to a number of things. Something that you want to avoid in a test is having items that may interfere with the processes that are required for ulterior items in your test. For instance, there's something that's known as proactive interference, and sometimes when you're trying to recall information from a given list of words, for instance, and then that information appears again in the following list, your performance drops. That's something that you may want to take into account. Uh, Another thing is that something that we know now is that you are able to process and to incorporate, especially when you're dealing with new languages and new vocabulary, the more multimodal your presentation is, the better the chances of your brain to retrieve it in the future. So if if you are given the chance to just present materials, in a written fashion, but then you have a chance to enrich that with, pictures and sounds and things like that. The more multimodal the presentation, the better the retrievability of the information is going to
Yeah.
be. Um, the something that is out of the curricula in general, and which is fundamental, is the engagement of your body. Maybe this is not so much for a testing situation, but certainly for learning situations. And there's a lot of studies, even conducted in actual classrooms, which show that when students are learning a new language, new vocabulary, and you compare how they do when they are just exposed to the written words, the recorded words and images, versus when they have all this, plus they engage their bodily systems. For instance, when you're learning the word clap, you actually move your hands as you do when you clap, or when you're
Yeah.
learning a word jump, you jump, or when you are, things like that. When you engage your body, then that information is better learned, it's more efficiently learned, and it lasts, and it's consolidated for longer in memory. That's another thing that it's worth sharing, I think. Not to say that this is easy to implement, because then again,
Exactly.
having 20 children, jumping around in the classroom can be hard to manage, of course. But the decision is ultimately up to each teacher. What we need to do is to mention that there's a lot of information that shows that bodily engagement favors the development of linguistic skills. Um, yeah, well, I guess we could go on with some questions about testing, but it's already 20, right, 12:20, right? So
Yeah.
I don't know, and I know that there are many other questions. So I don't know if we should.
I have something else, and I think that with this we can round up this conversation and leave you to your things. There are some things about the impact of the teaching of the suprasegmental aspects of speech.
Okay. So I don't know which direction the question is really going for, but yeah, a couple of things that we could say. When we're talking about suprasegmental aspects, we're talking about a number of interrelated but distinct phenomena, right? So your prosody is one thing, your pulsing is one thing, accentuation is another thing. You know, typically in non-tonal language, in non-tonal languages, you know, such as Spanish and even English, the brain mechanisms that are specialized for suprasegmental processing, they are partially independent from those that process segmental information at the phonemic level. Typically, in the vast majority of the population, you will find that left hemisphere mechanisms, especially spanning the so-called the dorsal pathways, the dorsal stream leading from the posterior superior temporal lobe to your inferior frontal gyrus. That's the core mechanism underlying phonemic sequencing skills in combination with the basal ganglia and things like that. And this is for most people in the left hemisphere. Not that it's entirely in the left hemisphere, but this is predominantly left hemisphere activity that it's involved in these activities. Now, when you think about suprasegmental information, it's actually, for the majority of people, the right hemisphere that has the upper hand, usually in contralateral homologue areas. So it's pretty much the same kind of circuitry, but on the other side of the brain, let's say. This does not operate the same way for all different languages. So, in fact, in languages that are tonal languages and in which prosody and the different tones actually point to differences in lexical meaning, this association is ethicist in a way. And I guess that something that's important to point out here is that different languages make use of suprasegmental features in different ways. For example, in Spanish, I mean, if you think about it,
Of course.
prosody in English, you know, the intonation in English is not so critical to tell a difference between a statement and a question or a command, for instance. It's basically the syntax that's the system that's co-opted to mark those differences. So if you have something that's, you know, subject and operator, you know, I will, it doesn't really matter what follows. You know that's chances are that's going to be a statement. But if you have something like will I, you know, it really doesn't matter what the intonation is. Just because you have will first and I, then chances are it's going to be a question, right? Now, so syntax plays a much more dominant role in establishing contrasts between the types of statements or let's say utterances that you can have in English. But in Spanish, it doesn't work like that. We rely much more heavily on intonation. So basically, in English, if I tell you, you will come tomorrow, or if I tell you, you will come tomorrow, you know, it's a statement. But if I say, will you come tomorrow? Or if I say, will you come tomorrow? In both questions, it's a question. In both cases, it's a question, right? Irrespective of what I'm doing with my intonation. Now, in Spanish, if I tell you, eh, Carlos va a venir mañana, o mañana va a venir Carlos, or you know, you can play around with the order of words as much as you do, and what's really going to make the difference is Carlos va a venir mañana. Oh, Carlos va a venir mañana. So
exactly,
that's something to be aware of. The fact that you can only think about suprasegmental features in language idiosyncratic ways. The moment you try to generalize how different languages opt for different systems to convey different grammatical contrasts, even, that's when you may actually be making wrong or suboptimal
Assumptions.
teaching decisions. Yeah.
Right. Well, thanks a lot, Adolfo. I think that you have given us very interesting information, lots of resources from which to look for information for those who are interested in introducing themselves to cognitive neuroscience. And I have received lots of positive comments from the audience and from the spectators. So thanks a lot for your time and for sharing all your knowledge.
On the contrary, thanks for the invitation. It was a lot of fun, and it's good to generate spaces to disseminate this
Exactly.
information. So if this reached at least a handful of people who are interested in this, mission accomplished. Thanks a lot, and till next time, I guess.
Thank